Hi everyone, today we are joined by Kassia St Clair, who is the author of The Secret Lives of Colour and the Golden Thread. Today we're going to be discussing all things colour, but specifically the Autumn-Winter 21-22 new key colours. So to jump straight in, do you remember the first time that you realised colour was very impactful and powerful?
I think some of my very earliest memories actually come from when I was very, very young, because my mother was a florist, and after school I used to go to her flower shop while she was closing up or in her final few hours, and I'd make little posies out of the blooms that hadn't quite made it into the proper bouquets. And so I remember kind of playing around with colour, and she herself was very creative, and so I think I got some of that love of colour from those times being with her in that flower shop, and I just have very, very vivid memories of the smell and those kind of, the playing around with the blooms, I think. Yeah,
it's all about those kind of colour combinations almost.
Yes.
Seeing how the colours play against each other.
And it was the 80s, so it was really big, bright, colourful bouquets. It was really big, bright, colourful everything.
Yeah. So what inspired you to create your Sunday Times best-selling novel, The Secret Lives of Colour?
Well, I studied history at university, and in particular I was looking at 18th century women's fashion, and even more specifically I was looking at what women wore to masquerade balls during the 18th century. And part of that involved reading letters and diaries and accounts of these amazing parties that people were going to. And what I noticed is that there was quite often this colour language that was operating between friends or kind of in the media. And they were colour terms that I did not recognise. And I realised that, this language, our language had moved on, our language of colour had moved on. And these specific terms, which had meant so much to these people, in the same city that we're in now, had effectively disappeared. And that fascinated me, that these fashionable shades that had so much currency then had disappeared. And quite often I would never know what those colours look like now, because we might not be lucky enough for someone to have sat down for a portrait wearing this particular colour. And that, if there was a portrait, it might not have survived until now. And so there was just no way of pinpointing it. And that to me is wonderful, the idea that colours can have these brief lives, but have such an intense place in a cultural moment.
So do you think, talking on that, just how significant colour was back then, do you think now as we're so saturated by so many colours, do you think colour's almost lost its importance in a way, or?
I think there's a difference in value on it because we have so much greater access. I know I'm probably one of many people who are guilty of this. One of the first things I do when I wake up in the morning is look through Instagram, get on my phone, and you just have this hit, in a way, of brilliant, saturated colours. If you think back to, not even that long ago, colour would have been a much more precious resource. And to be able to wear bright colours and to have access to bright colours in your home would have been something that people would have strived for. It would have been very expensive, and not everyone would have been able to ever access that in their lives. And so I do think that gives us a slightly different relationship today. I like to think that we're very lucky because we have access to so much colour.
So what was it about the kind of history of colour, or the pigments specifically, that really compelled you?
I love a good story. I love that these colours meant so much to people, and that people went through so much effort in order to have access to these colours. The sources for some of these colours might be insects or semi-precious stones, and these would have to be unearthed tens of thousands of miles away and then traded over these massive distances. And that is incredible. The effort and the passion that went in to creating colourful paintings or colourful textiles was enormous. And as a lover of stories, being able to access some of those moments and look into why people cared so much about particular colours, I just think that's fascinating.
So do you think it's important for anyone in the industry or in the wider world who works with colour to understand this rich, deep history?
I will have to admit some bias here. Of course, I think that it's very important for people who are working with colour to understand these stories, in part because that's why they have such rich emotional resonance, is because of their place in our culture and because of the stories that they can help us tell or help us understand. And these stories can shift over time. They can do shift over time. They shift depending on where you might live, and they even shift from person to person. Different people can have very different relationships with colour, and yet I believe that almost everyone has an emotional response to them. And so for people who are working with them, why not access it, access these stories, access these emotions to their greatest extent.
Touching on that, about how people just don't like colours or like certain colours, why do you think this is? Does this have something to do with the colour itself, or is it more to do with colour psychology? What kind of repels people or draws people to certain colours?
I think culture has, a lot of it is to do with culture. Different colours become fashionable. Sometimes they become sort of too fashionable. We see too much of them. We kind of sicken of them. A bit like hearing a song on the radio a bit too much, and then you just never want to hear it ever again. It can be a bit like that with colour, I think. And so when you look at the schemes and the colours that people 200 years ago, 300 years ago thought were absolutely fabulous and wanted to and thought were very natural looking, those are not the colours those are not the messages that we would necessarily associate with those shades today. And sometimes the colours that we think are rather ugly or unattractive kind of been the height of fashion, in previous times. And so the messages have really changed. But it can also be personal. If you have a very bad experience, if you go into a job interview wearing a particular coloured shirt, for example, or blouse, and you bomb and the interview is terrible and you don't get the job, you might not feel so great about that colour next time, and you might not want to wear that shirt or that blouse or even that colour ever again. So we do develop these personal relationships as well as being part of broader cultural conversations about colours.
So interesting, isn't it, how colour can differ from place to place, but also, especially about interior design, I think they touch on it a lot about how to decorate a room a certain way. And we found recently that sometimes even if a room's blue, you might go into it and initially feel calm, but then that feeling kind of dissipates after a couple of seconds. So I think it's almost people are forgetting the kind of primal response that we sometimes have to colour. And I think it's interesting when designers try and harness that again, in a way. But so in regards to colour trends, do you see that these kind of follow in the same patterns as they usually do? Are they kind of going round in loops, or are they evolving in any way?
I think with most, with almost all these things, it tends to be cyclical, and you see colours that have been forgotten about for a little while come back up again. And as I was, said previously about the comparison with songs that become very popular, I think if you're a colour, you might not want to have a moment where you become supremely fashionable, because with such a high peak can often come an equal reaction against a colour, and then it might not come back for a little while. While if a colour is sort of gently on the periphery and never the centre of attention, it's much more likely to sort of remain sort of a gentler part of the conversation for longer. At least that's what I tend to think. But even colours that have been incredibly fashionable, they do come back. A classic example is avocado green, which was so popular in the 70s, and then I remember moving into a house probably in the 90s, and it still had its avocado bath suite and basin, and of course we ripped it out, and now avocado is kind of coming back, and greens of all kinds are sort of coming back in interiors, and that would have never have crossed our minds, I don't think, when we moved into that house. I'm like, oh, this is revolting. Just because it was so redolent of a time, and I think it takes a little while for those bonds to dissolve, and then you begin to be able to appreciate a colour in a new context, in a new way.
Yeah, I've seen that with purple recently, like that really kind of royal purple. I think a lot of people seem to either really love it or hate it, and we've been seeing it come through on the catwalks again now, and I think it's going to start to come through back into the market. It's quite interesting because I always said I hate purple, but now I'm beginning to be like, maybe I can get on board with it.
Yeah, my opinion about that purple has really changed since I wrote the book
Oh,
because it's got such
really?
a wonderful story to
Yeah.
it. But I find it quite difficult to describe it to different audiences because, you know, as someone who's British, I very much associate it with sweet wrappers, you know, from Quality Street.
Yeah.
And that is a very British brand. And so I was once sort of on stage at America giving a talk about colour. This completely feeds into cultural context.
Yeah.
And I suddenly realised I didn't have a cultural reference. I said Quality Street and it was just blank faces.
Yeah.
And I had to sort of think of another way of describing it for a very different audience.
Yeah, that is so true, isn't it? It's like Cadbury's, all the
Yes.
like luxury
Yeah.
chocolate bars. So our 5 key colours for autumn/winter 21-22. We see these tones kind of really tap into a variety of different moods. We want them to be both calming and comforting, but also kind of offer some escapism. I think in the world we're all living in now, people are kind of wanting a bit of escapism. So could you touch on any of the colours, if they have any prominent origins or anything like that?
Yeah, so I think the first one, which I keep on wanting to say Harvest Gold, but is in fact Golden Harvest.
Yeah.
Harvest Gold was obviously a very popular colour in the 1970s, and so this is actually a very different colour. I almost sort of think of it as a kind of darker, spiced beige. It's really kind of a quite beautiful colour. I'm not usually a mad fan of beiges, but this is quite a beautiful example of it. And I think I love the kind of naturalness of it. Something that people don't necessarily know is that the word beige itself comes from the French word for kind of undyed woolen cloth, and I think that is something that has a real appeal, increasing appeal, when you think of our relationship with textiles and the idea of naturalness. And it's not just undyed wool, undyed, you know, cotton and silk also have that rather beautiful beigey tone. So I think that's really interesting, and I think that's something that's getting an increasing appeal as we begin to think more about our environmental impact, but it's also sort of has this natural wholesomeness to it. So I really like that. The other colour that I think is very sort of grounding in a way is the bloodstone, the dark red. Immediately this makes me think of red ochres, which are among the very earliest pigments that human beings ever used, and we've always been incredibly fond of it. You can find it in some of the earliest cave art. For example, lots of red ochres were used in burial contexts. In fact, almost everywhere where you find early human habitation, you find uses of this, you know, this gorgeous red natural pigment that can just be dug out of the earth. And this particular, you know, it's got a bit of brown to it. It's very natural. It's very, you know, earthy.
Yeah.
Really reminds me of that. The other thing it reminds me of is a pigment that was very popular in medieval times, which was called dragon's blood, because there was a belief, it's actually a resin, it's a tree resin, but there was a belief that it was actually a sort of stone that was produced when dragons and elephants fought and their blood mingled, hence dragon's blood.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
Wow.
But it's a really wonderful colour. It's also been used in sort of alchemy and has been used in traditional medicine in a lot of cultures as well. And I do think there's something about that. It feels like a powerful colour, I think, and has a real resonance with us.
Quite magical.
Yeah.
Yeah. So obviously, touching on sustainability a bit, we've kind of wanted to bring colours in now that will last longer than a season. So do you think these new key colours will last the test of time?
Well, like I said, I'm a real fan of Golden Harvest and Bloodstone, and I also really like Dark Springs because that is a beautiful colour. I really like greens. I think as a child of the 80s and early 90s, the latter two, the magenta and the AI aqua, I mean, they're gorgeous colours, but they remind me of terrible fashion choices that I made age sort of 14, 15, and so again, for personal reasons, I'm going to be a slower adopter. But you know, having said that, they also feel like slightly newer colours that, you know, are, you know, sort of on their way up at the moment. And it could be that in a year's time, in 2 years' time, I'll be eating my words and I can't get enough of magenta and aqua, and I'll be completely resold all over again. But yes, as a child of the 90s, there were these sort of, there was a lot of aqua and magenta around. I'm not too sure if I'm ready to dive back in.
Yeah, diving into that nostalgia.
Yes.
So finally, to finish up, what excites you most about colour?
It's definitely the stories. Being able to write this book and share these stories with people was really wonderful. It took quite a lot of persuasion. There was this idea that colours were a very niche topic and that no one would really be interested. And it's been an absolute pleasure to see that colour is actually kind of a language that we all share. We may have different opinions and very strong opinions, but people love telling these stories, and I love hearing stories that I might have missed in my research. I cannot get enough. I also love the fact that we're still working hard to create colours. More are being produced every day, and there's such excitement, when the blackest black ever is created, or there's the opportunity or possibility that we might create a whole new family of red pigments. That gets people really excited, and as someone who works in colour, I love that it's so much, it's got so much cultural currency at the moment.
Yeah, there's just endless possibilities, kind of.
For anyone listening who would like to find out more about the Secret Lives of Colour, then please head to KassiaStClair.com. And if you want to find out any more about the 5 key colours, then head to Coloro.com. Thank you.